The time is 7:28 a.m., July 1st, 1916, northern France, the Somme Valley. In 2 minutes, the largest artillery bombardment in British history will fall silent. In 2 minutes, the whistles will blow. In 2 minutes, 120,000 British soldiers will climb out of their trenches and begin walking toward the German lines across no man's land. They have been told the enemy is already dead, that 7 days of non-stop shelling have destroyed every German position, every machine gun, every wire entanglement. They have been told the path ahead is clear, that the hard work has already been done, by the guns, by the shells, by 7 days and 7 nights of unrelenting fire. They have been told this will be easy. They have been told wrong. Deep beneath the shattered earth, German soldiers crouch inside reinforced concrete bunkers, 30 feet underground. They have been living in those bunkers for a week. They have eaten their rations in the dark. They have slept, when sleep was possible, to the sound of the world ending above them. They have prayed and written letters and waited. They have survived the bombardment. They are waiting. Their machine guns are already loaded. In the headquarters at Beaucaire, 14 miles behind the front, General Sir Douglas Haig sits at his desk. He has already written in his diary that morning that the men are in excellent spirits. He has attended to his correspondence. He has reviewed the final orders. He is a man of routine, of discipline, of absolute confidence in the plan he has approved. He has no idea what is about to happen. Or perhaps, and this is the question history has never fully answered, he does. Decisions like this one, decisions made in silence, far from the guns, by men who would never face the consequences themselves, these are the decisions that changed history. If you want to understand how the world was shaped by the choices of leaders under impossible pressure, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe now, because every 2 days, we bring you another decision that altered the course of history. This is the Great War Decisions. And today, the first day of the Somme. By the summer of 1916, the First World War had already killed more men than any conflict in European history. The Western Front had been frozen for nearly 2 years. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, 2 armies faced each other across a strip of churned mud and barbed wire that stretched nearly 500 miles. Neither side could advance. Neither side could retreat. The war had become a siege. The longest, most lethal siege in the history of human warfare. Men lived in trenches that were, in the best sectors, elaborate systems of sandbagged walls and underground shelters. In the worst, they were flooded ditches where men stood in water to their knees for days. Rats moved through the trenches in their thousands. The smell of mud, of decay, of the dead who lay in no man's land because no one could reach them, was something that veterans described for the rest of their lives and never found adequate words for. This was the world of 1916. In February 1916, Germany launched a massive attack at Verdun, a fortress city in eastern France that held deep symbolic significance for the French nation. The German strategy was not to capture Verdun. It was to bleed France white, to force the French army into a battle of attrition so brutal, so relentless, so carefully calibrated to inflict maximum casualties, that France would collapse from sheer exhaustion. It was working. By June, the French army had suffered nearly 400,000 casualties at Verdun. Entire divisions had been fed into the battle and consumed. The French system of rotation, moving units in and out of the line to prevent complete breakdown, meant that by mid-1916, nearly every division in the French army had passed through Verdun at least once. The French army was not broken, but it was bending. The French commander, General Joffre, came to the British with an urgent request that bordered on desperation. Attack the Germans somewhere else, draw their forces away from Verdun, relieve the pressure, save what remained of the French army before it was too late. The British agreed. The location chosen was the Somme, a river valley in northern France where the British and French lines met. Rolling chalk hills, small villages, fields of wheat and sunflowers. In peacetime, it was one of the quieter, more pleasant corners of rural France. It was not chosen for its strategic value. The ground at the Somme offered no particular advantage. There was no critical railway junction to capture, no fortress to seize, no geographic feature whose possession would meaningfully alter the course of the war. It was chosen because it was where the two armies connected, because it was convenient. Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, had originally planned the Somme offensive for August. He wanted more time to prepare, more time to train the new army. The hundreds of thousands of volunteers who had answered Kitchener's call in 1914 and 1915, men who had never fought a battle in their lives, men who had enlisted because they believed in something, in their country, in the cause, in each other, and who had spent the past year and a half training in England, waiting for the moment they would be needed. That moment, Haig had hoped, would come in August. Joffre gave him no choice. The attack had to come in July. France was dying, and Britain had to act. Haig accelerated the timeline. The attack would begin on the 1st of July, 1916. What followed was not a battle. It was a catastrophe. Among the men who served under Haig, few were more experienced, more respected, or more ignored than General Sir Henry Rawlinson. Rawlinson commanded the British Fourth Army, the force that would carry the main weight of the Somme assault. He had fought in Sudan, in India, in the Boer War. He had held senior command since the earliest days of the Western Front. He understood what modern artillery could and could not do. And what he understood, deeply and clearly, was this: the German defenses on the Somme were not going to be destroyed by a week of shelling. The German positions on the Somme had been under construction for nearly 2 years. The Germans had chosen to fight a defensive war on the Western Front, and they had used that time with extraordinary discipline and intelligence. Their trenches were not shallow scrapes in the earth. They were elaborate underground fortresses, deep dugouts reinforced with concrete and timber, some of them 30 feet below the surface, connected by tunnels, equipped with electric lighting, stocked with food, water, and ammunition, enough to sustain a garrison for weeks. Rawlinson's own intelligence officers told him the same thing. The German wire, hundreds of meters of dense, rusted barbed wire that separated the two front lines, had not been cut by the bombardment. Reconnaissance photographs confirmed it. Pilots flying low over the lines in the days before the attack reported the same. In sector after sector, the wire was intact. In some places it had been thickened by the shell fire, the explosions throwing the wire into tangled, impassable masses. Rawlinson took these reports seriously. He proposed a more limited attack, what he called bite and hold. Instead of trying to break through the entire German line in a single day, he proposed capturing a portion of the German first trench, consolidating the position, bringing up artillery, and then advancing again when conditions allowed. Smaller gains, methodical progress, far fewer losses. Haig rejected it. Haig believed, and this belief was central to his entire strategic philosophy, the conviction that shaped every decision he made, that the German army was close to breaking, that the right pressure in the right place would crack the enemy's will to fight, that somewhere behind the German line there was a breaking point waiting to be found. He wanted not a bite and hold operation, but a breakthrough, a rupture in the German line so complete that cavalry could pour through and restore mobile warfare to the Western Front. The cavalry, in 1916, against machine guns and barbed wire and concrete bunkers. Haig had 3 cavalry divisions positioned behind the lines, ready to exploit the breakthrough he expected. Thousands of horses, thousands of men with lances and sabers, waiting for the gap in the German line that would never come. Rawlinson adapted his plan to satisfy Haig's ambitions, but the tension between them never disappeared. In private correspondence, in conversations with trusted subordinates, Rawlinson expressed serious doubts. He believed the objectives assigned to his men were too deep, that asking infantry to advance 5 miles on the first day of an attack through uncut wire and against intact machine gun positions was asking for more than was humanly possible. He said so, through proper channels, to the commander who outranked him. And then, when his objections were overruled, he did what officers of his generation and his class were trained to do from the moment they entered military service. He obeyed. The plan for July 1st, 1916, was built on a single assumption: that 7 days of continuous artillery bombardment would obliterate the German defenses completely. The numbers behind this assumption were staggering. The British had assembled 1,537 artillery pieces along the Somme front, one gun for every 17 yards of the front line. They fired over 1.5 million shells in the 7 days before the attack. The sound of the guns could be heard in London, across the English Channel, 200 miles away. Men in southern England reported feeling the vibration in their chests, a deep, subterranean pulse that never stopped. For 7 days and 7 nights, the German line was continuously bombarded. There were moments of particular intensity and moments of relative quiet, but the guns never entirely stopped. The earth of the Somme was churned and rechurned until it no longer resembled earth at all. It became a lunar landscape of overlapping craters, of upturned soil and shattered timber and fragments of metal. From the British trenches, looking out across no man's land at the German positions, the view was of continuous explosion, a wall of smoke and fire that seemed to consume everything it touched. The plan called for the infantry to advance at 0 hour, 7:30 a.m., in a series of waves, walking at a steady pace across no man's land. The men were told not to run. Running, the planners argued, would cause the waves to lose cohesion. The carefully dressed lines would dissolve into a mob. They were to walk, steadily, calmly in formation, to the German first trench, which they would find unoccupied, because everyone inside it would be dead. They were given specific objectives: the village of Thiepval, the ridge at Pozières. The town of Bapaume, 7 miles behind the German line, was listed as a Day 1 objective in some of the more optimistic planning documents. In some sectors, the men were told they would be drinking coffee in the German second trench by mid-morning. The men were given extra equipment to carry: picks, shovels, coils of barbed wire, sandbags, extra ammunition, signal flares, carrier pigeons in wicker cages, because once they captured the German positions, they would need to fortify them immediately against the inevitable counterattack. Some soldiers carried 66 pounds of equipment on their backs, more than half their own body weight. In the July heat, that weight was almost impossible to bear even standing still. Walking across broken ground under fire, it would prove lethal. Tunneling companies of the Royal Engineers had spent months digging enormous mines beneath the German lines, chambers packed with hundreds of tons of high explosive, positioned directly under the strongest German fortifications. The tunnelers worked in silence, in constant fear of detection, knowing that the Germans were tunneling too, that somewhere in the dark earth between the lines, 2 groups of men were digging toward each other. Just before 0 hour, 19 of these mines would detonate simultaneously. 2 of the mines were detonated early, 10 minutes before 0 hour, at 7:20 a.m. This was a decision made at the local level, by officers who believed the early detonation would give their men an advantage. In fact, it gave the Germans 10 minutes of warning. The largest of the mines, at La Boisselle, containing 60,000 pounds of ammonal, detonated at 7:28 a.m., 2 minutes before 0 hour. The explosion was visible from 40 miles away. The crater it left was 300 feet wide and 90 feet deep. It can still be seen today, a vast circular scar in the Picardy landscape, a permanent wound in the earth. The men who were supposed to advance through those craters were ordered to wait 10 minutes before moving, to allow the debris to settle. By the time they arrived at the crater's edge, German soldiers who had survived the explosion had climbed out of their bunkers and were already setting up machine guns on the rim. Small decisions, fatal consequences. At 7:28 a.m., the guns fell silent. After 7 days of continuous bombardment, the sudden quiet was more terrifying than the noise had been. Men in the trenches described it as the most profound silence they had ever experienced. A silence that seemed to have weight, to press down on them, to make the air itself feel thick and strange. Soldiers checked their equipment for the last time. Some prayed. Some smoked a final cigarette. Some simply stared at the parapet above them and thought of home, of their mothers, their wives, their children, the streets where they had grown up, the fields they had worked, the lives they had left behind. Private Stanley Bradbury of the Sheffield City Battalion wrote a letter to his wife in the minutes before 0 hour. He folded it, placed it in his breast pocket, and climbed the ladder. In the German dugouts, soldiers who had been living underground for a week felt the earth stop shaking. The silence told them everything they needed to know. They grabbed their machine guns. They began climbing. At 7:30 a.m., the whistles blew along a 16-mile front. The sound of those whistles, hundreds of them, all at once, up and down the line, was a sound that every man who heard it and survived described for the rest of his life. It was the sound of the world changing, the sound of an age ending. The British and Allied infantry climbed out of their trenches and walked into the morning sun. What happened next happened in minutes. In some places, in seconds. The machine guns opened fire. The German MG-08, the standard German machine gun of the First World War, could fire between 400 and 500 rounds per minute. It was water-cooled, which meant it could fire almost continuously without overheating. One machine gun, properly positioned and manned by a trained crew, could cover an entire sector of no man's land. The Germans had positioned their machine guns with care, with overlapping fields of fire, so that every inch of the ground between the trenches was covered by at least one gun. In many sectors, it was covered by 3 or 4. The British infantry walked into this fire in waves, just as the plan required. The first wave was cut down. The second wave walked through the bodies of the first and was cut down in turn. The third wave followed. At Beaumont Hamel, in the northern sector, the Newfoundland Regiment, men from the most distant corner of the British Empire, who had crossed the Atlantic to fight for a country most of them had never seen, advanced toward the German lines. They had to cross not only no man's land but the British support trenches as well, because the communication trenches leading to the front were blocked with the bodies of the men who had gone before them. They had to go over the top from 500 yards behind the British front line. They walked 500 yards of open ground before they even reached their own front trench. In 30 minutes, 710 men were killed or wounded out of 801 who had gone over the top. The regiment effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. When the roll was called the following morning, only 68 men answered their names. 68 men, out of 801. The Newfoundland government declared July 1st a day of national mourning. It still is. At Gommecourt, on the far northern flank, 2 divisions attacked as a deliberate diversionary feint. Their purpose not to capture territory, but to draw German attention and reserves away from the main assault. They knew they were a diversion. They knew the attack was designed not to succeed, but to distract. They attacked anyway, because that was the order. They gained nothing. They lost nearly 8,000 men. Along the Albert Bapaume Road, in the center of the British line, the 34th Division attacked the village of La Boisselle, the sector of the Great Mines. The explosion had been spectacular. The ground was shattered. And yet, when the infantry arrived, German machine gunners were waiting on the crater rims. The 34th Division suffered nearly 6,000 casualties in a single day. It remains the heaviest loss suffered by any British division in a single day in the entire war. At Serres, in the northern sector, 4 PALS battalions from the city of Sheffield, Bradford, Leeds, and Barnsley advanced into fire so intense that they were destroyed before they reached the German wire. The wire that had not been cut. The wire that the 7-day bombardment had been supposed to eliminate. The Sheffield City Battalion, formerly the 12th Battalion, York and Lancaster Regiment, lost 513 men in under an hour. Most of them fell within 200 yards of their own trenches. The Accrington PALS, officially the 11th Battalion, East Lancashire Regiment, lost 584 men in the first 20 minutes of the assault. The town of Accrington in Lancashire had a population of approximately 45,000 people. In those 20 minutes, the town lost more than 1 in every 100 of its inhabitants, not its soldiers. Its inhabitants. The telegram boys began arriving in Accrington that afternoon. They kept arriving for days. Not all of July 1st was disaster. In the southern sector, where the chalk downland favored the attacker and where French heavy artillery, superior in quality to the British guns, had been more effective, British and French forces captured their objectives and advanced significantly. The 30th Corps, under General Congreve, took the villages of Mametz and Montauban and advanced nearly a mile beyond its starting line. It was a genuine success, achieved at serious but manageable cost. General Allenby's forces on the southern flank took their objectives. A gap appeared in the German line, a gap that, if exploited with speed and decision, might have allowed a meaningful advance. The cavalry divisions were alerted, the orders to advance were prepared, and then nothing. Because in the north and the center, where the main assault had been concentrated, where the plan had called for the decisive breakthrough, the lines had not moved. The attacks had failed. The German line was intact, and Haig, at his headquarters 14 miles behind the front, was only slowly receiving the fragmentary and contradictory reports that told him what had actually happened. Communications were catastrophically poor. The telephone cables that connected the front to the rear had been cut by German shellfire. Runners, young men sent on foot through the shellfire with written messages, were being killed before they could deliver their reports. The artillery observers in their forward positions were cut off from their batteries. In this information vacuum, optimistic reports floated upward, and pessimistic ones sank. An officer who reported that his men had taken their objective, even if he was wrong, even if he was reporting on the situation an hour ago before the counterattack, was confirming what the plan had predicted. His report was forwarded. The officer who reported that his battalion no longer existed as a fighting force was reporting failure, was contradicting the plan, was saying things that headquarters did not want to hear. Haig chose to believe the optimistic reports. He ordered the cavalry to prepare to advance. He sent messages to his corps commanders asking them to press forward, to maintain the momentum, to exploit the success that the optimistic reports suggested was occurring. The cavalry never moved. By the end of July 1st, 1916, the British Army had suffered 57,270 casualties. Of those, 19,240 men were dead, killed outright or so badly wounded that they died before they could be reached. It was the single worst day in the history of the British Army. It remains so today. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend in the abstract, so consider them in comparison. On D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, one of the largest, most complex, most meticulously planned amphibious assaults in the history of warfare, the Allied forces suffered approximately 10,000 casualties across all beaches and all airborne operations combined. The planning for D-Day took years. The forces involved numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The logistical effort was unprecedented in human history. The first day of the Somme was nearly 6 times worse. The men who died on July 1st, 1916, were not, with some exceptions, professional soldiers. They were the volunteers of Kitchener's new army. Men who had answered the call in 1914 because they believed in something. Teachers and miners, clerks and factory workers, farmers and football players. Men who had stood in long queues outside recruiting offices in the autumn of 1914, who had lied about their ages to enlist, who had wept when they were turned away for being too short or too young and come back the next day to try again. The PALS battalions were their particular creation. The idea had been simple. Men would enlist more readily if they could serve alongside men they already knew. So the army had created battalions recruited from the same city, the same neighborhood, the same factory, the same football club. The Sheffield City Battalion, the Leeds Pals, the Bradford Pals, the Grimsby Chums, the Accrington Pals. When a Pals battalion was destroyed, an entire community was destroyed with it. The men who had grown up on the same street, who had gone to the same school, who had played together as children and worked together as men. They died together. When the telegrams arrived in Accrington, they did not arrive for one family and then another. They arrived for every family on the street. In the weeks after July 1st, the impact on the small towns and cities of northern England was shattering. There were streets in Sheffield where every house had lost a son. There were villages in Lancashire where the entire male population between the ages of 18 and 30 had been wiped out in a single morning. The grief was not abstract. It was not statistical, it was personal and immediate, and it lived on in those communities for generations. Douglas Haig did not lose his command after the Somme. This fact has astonished, infuriated, and puzzled historians for over a century. In the immediate aftermath of July 1st, the British government knew that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The casualty figures, which could not be entirely concealed, though the government tried to manage their release, told a story of failure on a scale that had no precedent. Prime Minister Asquith visited the front in early July and came away shaken. Lloyd George, then Secretary of State for War, had never trusted Haig and trusted him even less after the Somme. Within the senior levels of the British government, there were serious, if carefully guarded, discussions about whether the commander of the BEF should be replaced. Haig survived for several reasons, none of them particularly reassuring about the nature of institutional power. First, there was no obvious replacement. Kitchener, the great military icon whose face stared from every recruiting poster in England, the man who might have had the authority and the public standing to challenge Haig, had drowned in June 1916 when HMS Hampshire struck a German mine off the coast of Orkney. He was gone. The men available to replace Haig were not clearly superior to him, and changing commanders in the middle of a major offensive was an admission of failure that the government was not yet ready to make. Second, Haig had powerful allies. King George V supported him personally and consistently. The senior figures of the British military establishment, men who had served with Haig, who believed in his abilities, who were deeply invested in the strategic vision he represented, rallied around him. Third, and most importantly, the war continued. The Somme continued. And as the weeks passed, and the daily casualties, still terrible, still staggering by any normal measure, were at least not the mass slaughter of July 1st, Haig constructed a narrative. He argued that the offensive was working, that German strength was being eroded, that the German army was paying a price in men and morale that it could not sustain indefinitely, that the Somme was achieving its strategic purpose, even if it was not achieving it in the dramatic, cavalry charging through the gap fashion he had originally envisioned. Haig was promoted to Field Marshal in December 1916. He was still in command. After the war, public opinion shifted sharply against Haig. The poets had already spoken: Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Robert Graves, men who had fought, who had watched their friends die, who wrote with a bitterness and precision that cut through every official narrative. The phrase, "lions led by donkeys," entered the popular imagination and never left. Lloyd George, who became Prime Minister in December 1916, despised Haig personally and professionally. He described him as brilliant to the top of his army boots, meaning not brilliant at all. He tried repeatedly to remove Haig from command. He repeatedly failed. Haig died in 1928. His funeral was attended by enormous crowds. By the 1960s and 1970s, the harsher verdict had taken hold. The image of the cold general in his chateau, ordering men to their deaths from 14 miles away, is the image that endures. The truth, as it usually does, resists such simplicity. But the men of the Newfoundland Regiment, the Accrington Pals, the Sheffield City Battalion, they are not a simplification, they are a fact. The Somme did not end the war, but it changed it. The German army that emerged from the Somme in November 1916 was fundamentally different from the army that had entered it. The experienced non-commissioned officers, the corporals and sergeants who were the real backbone of any army, the men who knew how to do everything, who could be relied upon when officers were killed, who carried institutional knowledge and tactical competence that took years to develop. Many of them were gone. The German army would spend the next 2 years struggling to replace what the Somme had taken from it. At Verdun, the pressure on the French army was relieved. The German forces that had been grinding the French down, the artillery, the infantry, the reserves that Falkenhayn had been feeding into the battle, were needed on the Somme. The assault on Verdun was scaled back. France survived. It is not certain, given the state of the French army by the summer of 1916, that France would have survived another 6 months at the same pace. The tactical lessons of the Somme were not lost on everyone. In the weeks and months after July 1st, junior officers and experienced NCOs who had survived began thinking carefully about what had gone wrong and what might be done differently. The lessons were painful but clear. Massed waves of infantry walking in formation into intact machine gun positions did not work. It had never worked. It would never work. What worked, what small groups of men had discovered, often by accident, in the chaos of the July fighting, was something different. Moving in small groups, using shell holes for cover, finding gaps rather than assaulting strongpoints, bypassing resistance and pressing forward, leaving the isolated positions for the men behind to deal with. Decentralizing decision-making so that the corporal on the ground, who could see what was actually happening, had the authority to act on what he saw. These ideas would be systematized and refined over the following 2 years, culminating in the tactics used in the 100 Days Offensive of 1918, the offensive that finally broke the German army and ended the war. The tank made its first battlefield appearance during the Somme offensive, on the 15th of September, 1916. Haig had pushed for their use over the objections of those who wanted to wait until there were enough of them to deploy en masse and achieve a decisive effect. He used the 49 available tanks in small groups, scattered across a wide front, on terrain that was entirely unsuitable for tracked vehicles. The tactical impact was minimal, but the potential was visible. The idea had been proven. The machine that would eventually break the deadlock of the Western Front had made its debut, however inauspicious. The Battle of the Somme formally ended on the 18th of November 1916, when the onset of winter and the complete exhaustion of both sides made further operations impossible. The British and Allied line had advanced an average of 5 miles from its starting position. In the context of the Western Front, where advances were measured in hundreds of yards, 5 miles was considered meaningful. In the spring of 1917, the Somme region became strategically irrelevant. The Germans, recognizing that the ground they had defended at such cost was no longer tenable, carried out Operation Alberich, a deliberate planned withdrawal to the shorter, stronger Hindenburg line, 30 miles to the east. They abandoned, without a fight, every village and every ridge and every square mile of ground that the Somme offensive had so bloodily contested. The men had died for ground that Germany simply chose to walk away from. There is a particular kind of courage that history rarely celebrates. It is not the courage of the man who climbs out of the trench. That courage, physical, immediate, visceral, the courage of the body placed in the path of bullets, is visible and comprehensible. We can imagine it, even when we know we cannot truly understand it. It has been celebrated in poetry, in painting, in film, in the memorials that stand in every town and village in Britain and France and the Dominions. We know what to do with that courage. The other kind of courage is rarer and harder to see. It does not look like courage at all from the outside. It looks like insubordination. It looks like weakness. It looks like a man who cannot commit to a decision, who keeps raising objections, who fails to show the confidence that leadership is supposed to require. It is the courage to tell a powerful man that he is wrong, to say, clearly and on the record, with your name attached, the plan will fail. The assumptions are false. The price being asked is too high for what is being offered in return. I have the evidence. I have the photographs, the reports, the testimony of the men who have actually been there. And what the evidence shows is this. If we proceed as planned, thousands of men will die for nothing. Henry Rawlinson had that courage, in his way. He had the intelligence reports and the reconnaissance photographs and the honest assessments of his own officers. He understood what the German dugouts could withstand. He knew the wire had not been cut. He put his doubts in writing, raised them through the proper channels, proposed an alternative that the evidence supported. And then, when he was overruled, he obeyed. This is the tragedy that the first day of the Somme forces us to confront, not just as a story about the First World War, but as a story about human institutions in every age and every context. It is not simply a story of incompetent generals sending brave men to die for nothing. It is a story about the architecture of authority, about the systems we build to organize human effort on a massive scale, and the ways those systems can, in their very structure, prevent the right information from reaching the right decision-maker at the right time. Haig did not want to fail. He was not, in any simple sense, indifferent to the lives of his soldiers. He was a man who believed, genuinely, deeply, with a conviction that never wavered in the face of evidence, that decisive offensive action was the only way to win the war, that the German army, like every army, had a breaking point, that the way to find that breaking point was to press and press and press again until something gave. That belief was wrong, but it was held sincerely. And in an institution that rewarded confidence and punished doubt, that belief became self-reinforcing. The reports that confirmed it were elevated. The reports that challenged it were minimized. The officer who said, "I think this will work," rose. The officer who said, "I think this will fail," was watched carefully for signs of insufficient fighting spirit. The problem was not that Haig was evil. The problem was that he was certain. Certainty, in a military leader, is sometimes the most dangerous quality of all. It creates a hierarchy of information, where evidence that confirms existing beliefs is elevated, and evidence that challenges them is minimized or ignored. Where the optimistic report is forwarded up the chain, and the pessimistic assessment is filed away. Where the cavalry is kept saddled and ready to advance, even after the cavalry's hour has clearly passed. We see this pattern throughout history, in every domain of human organization. The leader who is too committed to a plan to hear the warnings that the plan is failing. The institution that punishes honest assessment and rewards confident projection. The meeting in which everyone in the room knows the truth, and no one says it, because everyone is waiting for someone with more authority to speak first. The corporation that keeps investing in a failing strategy because changing course would require admitting the original strategy was wrong. The government that persists in a policy long after the evidence of its failure is overwhelming, because the alternative is an admission of error that no one in the room has the courage to make. The army that orders the cavalry to advance when everyone on the ground knows the cavalry cannot advance. 57,470 casualties, 19,240 dead, not in a week, not in a campaign, in a single day. The question that July 1st, 1916 asks of us is not whether Douglas Haig was a good man or a bad one, whether he was a hero or a villain, a genius or a fool. History has never settled that question, and probably never will. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable. In the institutions we build, in the organizations we lead or follow or serve, when someone with the evidence, with the photographs and the reports and the honest assessment of what is actually happening, says this will not work, do we listen? Or do we blow the whistle and walk into the open ground and hope for the best? The first day of the Somme remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Not the bloodiest day of the First World War. That distinction belongs to the Eastern Front, where the scale of slaughter was even more incomprehensible. Not the bloodiest day of the 20th century. Those records belong to other catastrophes, on other fronts, in other wars. But the bloodiest day of the British Army. In more than 3 centuries of organized military history, from Marlborough to the Falklands, no single day has cost the British Army more than the 1st of July, 1916. And it happened because of a decision. A decision made by a man at a desk, 14 miles behind the front, who believed he knew what was happening better than the evidence showed. Who chose the report that confirmed what he wanted to believe over the report that told him the truth. Who ordered the cavalry to advance when the infantry was already dead. Next time, we look at another decision, one that was made not on a battlefield, but in the coded silence of a foreign ministry. A telegram, sent in secret, intercepted by chance, and decoded by a team of British analysts working in a basement in London. A message that, once read, made the continuation of American neutrality impossible. A decision that brought a nation of 90 million people into the war and changed everything. If this episode made you think differently about leadership, about the cost of certainty, about the ordinary men who paid the price for the decisions of extraordinary men, share it with someone who would appreciate it. Subscribe to the Great War Decisions. Every 2 days, another order that changed history. The orders that changed history.